In fact, Mr. President, you have 350 million people to liberate. But to liberate 350 million people, you have to imprison some.
Do you allow men to play in women's sports? Do you allow men to box your women and boxers? I know you have a lot of boxing.
That's violence.
That's up to El Salvador if they want to return him. That's not up to us.
Well, I'm supposed to have suggested that I smuggle a terrorist into the United States, right?
It's always the
How can I smuggle? How can I return him to the United States? Like I smuggle him into the United States, or whether I do it? Of course, I'm not going to do it.
And no court in the United States has a right to conduct the foreign policy of the United States. It's that simple. End of story.
Mr. President, you said that if the Supreme Court said someone needed to be returned, that you would abide by that. You said that on Air Force One just a few days ago. And they said that it must be facilitated.
Why don't you just say, isn't it wonderful that we're keeping criminals out of our country? Why can't you just say that? Why do you go over and over, and that's why nobody watches you anymore? And I just asked the president, it's this massive complex that he built, jail complex. I said, can you build some more of them, please? As many as we can get out of our country that were allowed in here by incompetent Joe Biden. I said it to Pam. I don't know what the laws are. We always have to obey the laws, but we also have homegrown criminals that push people into subways, that hit elderly ladies on the back of the head with a baseball bat when they're not looking, that are absolute monsters. I'd like to include them in the group of people to get them out of the country.
In a critical meeting in the Oval Office today, President Donald Trump and El Salvador's President Nayib Bukele engaged in a tense conversation that illuminated the deepening complexities of U.S. immigration policy. The crux of the discussion, the contentious case of Kilmar Abrego Garcia, a Maryland man deported to El Salvador, and the broader ramifications of U.S.-El Salvador relations in the context of Trump's stringent immigration reforms. Today, we explore the legal, ethical, and geopolitical implications of this unprecedented diplomatic standoff. At the heart of the controversy lies the case of Kilmar Abrego Garcia, a Maryland resident who was deported to El Salvador despite a court order preventing his removal. The U.S. Supreme Court had directed the Trump administration to facilitate Garcia's return to the U.S., yet President Bukele's government remains resolute in its decision to keep him in the country. Bukele's response was unequivocal.
Well, I'm supposed to have suggested that I smuggle a terrorist into the United States, right?
It's always
How can I smuggle? How can I return him to the United States? Like I smuggle him into the United States, or what do I do? Of course, I'm not going to do it. It's like, the question is preposterous. How can I smuggle a terrorist into the United States? I don't have the power to return him to the United States.
But you can release him inside of Salvador.
Yeah, but I'm not releasing. We're not very fond of releasing terrorists into our country. We just turned the murder capital of the world into the safest country of the Western Hemisphere, and you want us to go back into the releasing criminals so we can go back to being the murder capital of the world? No, that's not going to happen.
Well, they'd love to have a criminal, released into our
I mean, there's a fascination.
They would love it.
Yeah.
They're sick. These are sick people.
President Bukele's sharp rhetoric, labeling the U.S. request as preposterous, raises a host of questions. By framing Garcia's potential return as an impossibility, Bukele is not only questioning U.S. legal authority, but also asserting El Salvador's sovereignty in matters of immigration and criminal justice. His position, however, complicates the U.S.-El Salvador relationship, given the Supreme Court's direct intervention in the case.
Marco, do you have something to say about that?
Yeah, Stephen outlined it. I don't understand what the confusion is. This individual is a citizen of El Salvador. He was illegally in the United States and was returned to his country. That's where you deport people, back to their country of origin. Except for Venezuela, that wasn't refusing to take people back, or places like that. I can tell you this, Mr. President. No, the foreign policy of the United States is conducted by the President of the United States, not by a court. And no court in the United States has a right to conduct the foreign policy of the United States. It's that simple. End of story.
Rubio's statement reflects a deeper ideological divide on the role of the U.S. judiciary in foreign affairs. He argues that the courts, particularly the Supreme Court, should not be in the business of dictating U.S. foreign policy. This line of reasoning aligns with the Trump administration's broader view that foreign policy decisions, such as how to handle the deportation of individuals to foreign nations, should be exclusively the domain of the executive branch. But this argument is not without controversy. On one hand, Rubio's position emphasizes the constitutional separation of powers, particularly the prerogative of the president in managing foreign relations. This interpretation suggests that judicial interference could undermine executive authority and complicate diplomatic relations, especially when dealing with sovereign nations like El Salvador. From this perspective, a foreign government's refusal to comply with U.S. legal mandates could be seen as an issue that transcends domestic law. On the other hand, there's the opposing argument that judicial oversight is a fundamental check on executive power. The U.S. legal system, with its system of checks and balances, has historically ensured that no one branch of government wields unchecked authority, especially on matters involving individual rights. In the case of Garcia, the Supreme Court's involvement underscores the judiciary's role in protecting constitutional rights, even when foreign policy is at stake. Rubio's quote and his broader argument reflect the tension between executive power and judicial oversight in the realm of foreign policy. As the standoff between the U.S. and El Salvador continues, it raises critical questions. Should the judiciary have the authority to intervene in foreign policy matters that directly affect U.S. citizens? Or does the executive branch hold primacy in determining how the U.S. interacts with foreign governments on these issues? On the other side, Trump's administration has consistently underscored its stance that Garcia, being a citizen of El Salvador, is subject to the laws of his country of origin. The Trump administration's position rests on a foundational assertion of sovereignty, El Salvador's right to control its own citizens. However, this argument does not resolve the fundamental question. What happens when a foreign government defies U.S. legal mandates?
Sure, President. First and foremost, he was illegally in our country. He had been illegally in our country. And in 2019, two courts, an immigration court and an appellate immigration court, ruled that he was a member of MS-13 and he was illegally in our country. Right now, it was additional paperwork had needed to be done. That's up to El Salvador if they want to return him. That's not up to us. The Supreme Court ruled, President, that if, as El Salvador wants to return him, this is international matters, foreign affairs, if they wanted to return him, we would facilitate it, meaning provide a plane.
Pam Bondi, Trump's attorney general, doubled down on the notion that Garcia's deportation was justified, stressing his illegal status in the U.S. While legally sound, this perspective sidesteps deeper constitutional and human rights issues. Garcia's deportation and the subsequent refusal to return him showcases the tension between U.S. court rulings and the sovereign rights of foreign nations. The U.S. government's stance also raises questions about the broader implications for international law and human rights. To what extent can a sovereign nation defy U.S. judicial authority?
Well, Mr. President, you said that if the Supreme Court said someone needed to be returned, that you would abide by that. You said that on Air Force One just a few days ago. And they said that it must be facilitated.
Why don't you just say, isn't it wonderful that we're keeping criminals out of our country? Why can't you just say that? Why do you go over and over, and that's why nobody watches you anymore? You know, you have no credibility.
Trump's response is, in typical fashion, a blend of deflection and self-promotion. Rather than addressing the specifics of the Supreme Court ruling or the delicate diplomatic situation with El Salvador, he dismisses the question entirely, deflecting the focus to the broader success of his administration's hardline stance on immigration. Trump's remark also underscores his deep frustration with the media, which he frequently accuses of misrepresenting his administration's actions. In this instance, his response is not only an attempt to redirect the conversation, but also a reminder of his long-standing strategy of leveraging tough rhetoric on crime and immigration to bolster his political image. In the Trump administration's ongoing effort to tighten immigration controls and remove dangerous individuals from the U.S., the president's vision has increasingly expanded to include not only foreign nationals, but also American citizens. During his meeting with El Salvador's President Bukele, Trump proposed a controversial idea that raised serious questions about due process and the scope of U.S. authority.
Step further, I mean, I said it to Pam, I don't know what the laws are, we always have to obey the laws, but we also have homegrown criminals that push people into subways, that hit elderly ladies on the back of the head with a baseball bat when they're not looking, that are absolute monsters. I'd like to include them in the group of people to get them out of the country, but you'll have to be looking at the laws on that, Steve, okay?
Trump's proposal to deport American citizens, particularly those he categorizes as homegrown criminals, reveals the extreme measures he is willing to consider in his push for tighter immigration policies. While the idea is legally complex, if not outright unconstitutional, Trump's rhetoric is part of his broader effort to build a tough-on-crime populist image. However, the legality of such an action is deeply questionable. U.S. citizens are granted constitutional protections, and deporting them to foreign nations without due process would raise profound concerns about human rights and the sanctity of legal systems. Moreover, Trump's assertion that we always have to obey the laws is complicated by his repeated proposals that seem to sidestep established legal frameworks in pursuit of political goals. President Bukele's rhetoric is not merely a response to U.S. demands, it is emblematic of his broader authoritarian populist strategy. Bukele's tough-on-crime agenda, which includes incarcerating thousands of gang members, has made him immensely popular in El Salvador, but deeply controversial internationally. His government's disregard for due process and civil liberties, including suspending basic rights under a state of emergency, raises serious human rights concerns. But when it comes to dealing with U.S. citizens, the implications could be far-reaching.
It comes in. We have bad ones too, and I'm all for it because we can do things with the president for less money and have great security. And we have a huge prison population. We have a huge number of prisons, and then we have the private prisons, and some are operated well, I guess, and some aren't. But he does a great job with that. We have others that we're negotiating with too. But no, if it's a homegrown criminal, I have no problem.
Trump's suggestion to send homegrown U.S. criminals to El Salvador for incarceration reveals an alarming attitude toward justice. The question arises, is the U.S. sacrificing its values in exchange for short-term political alliances? Can a nation like El Salvador, with a questionable human rights record, be trusted to uphold justice when it comes to U.S. citizens? Furthermore, what does this mean for the future of extradition treaties, the protection of U.S. citizens abroad, and the integrity of the U.S. legal system? Beyond the legal and ethical implications, the meeting between Trump and Bukele has significant geopolitical consequences. El Salvador's position on Garcia illustrates its growing independence from U.S. influence, particularly as Bukele has cultivated a favorable relationship with Trump. Yet, this relationship is fraught with contradictions. While Bukele is hailed as an ally in the war on drugs and gang violence, his government's actions raise questions about the future of democracy and human rights in El Salvador.
And I just asked the president, it's this massive complex that he built, jail complex. I said, can you build some more of them, please? As many as we can get out of our country that were allowed in here by incompetent Joe Biden through open borders. Open borders. You probably hear open borders and you can't even understand it because nobody can understand it. Nobody smart or with common sense can understand it. So we have millions of people that should not be in this country that are dangerous. Not just people, because we have people, but we have millions of people that are murderers, drug dealers. They've been allowed to come into our country by other countries that were very smart. When they heard that this very low IQ president, and by the way, I took my cognitive exam as part of my physical exam, and I got the highest mark, and one of the doctors said, sir, I've never seen anybody get that kind of, that was the highest mark. I hope you're happy with that. Although they haven't been bugging me too much to take a cognitive, but I did do my physical and it was released. I hope you're all happy with it. I notice there's no question, so probably you are.
His suggestion, however, raises important ethical and logistical questions. while Bukele has built a notorious prison complex in El Salvador to house gang members, expanding this to include thousands more deported individuals, including non-criminal migrants, would blur the lines between justice and detention, creating further controversy over the treatment of individuals in foreign detention facilities. Trump's reliance on foreign prison systems and his call for more facilities highlights the stark contrast in his administration's approach to crime and immigration compared to traditional diplomatic strategies. It also shows how his administration has increasingly sought to externalize U.S. problems, transferring responsibility for complex issues like immigration and criminal justice to countries like El Salvador. President Trump and President Bukele's partnership is emblematic of the challenges facing modern diplomacy, where national security interests often collide with fundamental human rights. As El Salvador's defiance of U.S. legal authority grows, so too does the risk of undermining the principles that have historically governed international relations. The case of Kilmar Abrego Garcia may be a microcosm of a larger, more troubling trend, one that could reshape the future of U.S. foreign policy. But the question remains, does this rhetoric reflect a genuine diplomatic partnership, or is it simply an extension of Trump's preference for punitive solutions to complex social and legal issues?
In fact, Mr. President, you have 350 million people to liberate. But to liberate 350 million people, you have to imprison some. That's the way it works, right? You cannot just free the criminals and think crime's going to go down magically. You have to imprison them so you can liberate 350 million Americans that are asking for the end of crime and the end of terrorism. And it can be done. I mean, you're doing it already. And I'm sure that people have seen the change in the streets. A long way to go because you're just initiating your second term. But it's clear that, with the numbers at the border, even in Democrat-run cities, they get it home from the work you're doing. So I'm really happy to be here, honored, and eager to help.
Those days are over. Okay. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, guys. Thank you, guys. Mr. President, any comment on the FTC's case against Meta and Mark Zuckerberg?
Thank you, Press.
Thank you, Nayib. Thank you.